This season, Instacart has your back to school. As in, they've got your back to school lunch favorites, like snack packs and fresh fruit. And they've got your back to school supplies, like backpacks, binders, and pencils. And they've got your back when your kid casually tells you they have a huge school project due tomorrow. Let's face it, we were all that kid. So first call your parents to say I'm sorry, and then download the Instacart app to get delivery in as fast as 30 minutes all school year long. Get a $0 delivery fee for your first 3 orders while supplies last. Minimum $10 per order. Additional terms apply.
Hello and welcome to the All Monitor Brief. It's April 3rd. I'm Kristen Tolman. Today's main segment is an interview with All Monitor State Department correspondent Elizabeth Hagedorn, featuring her exclusive piece diving into the U.S.'s plan to send American diplomats back to Libya. But first, let's get you caught up on the headlines. The Palestinians on Tuesday officially revived their bid for full member state status in the United Nations. The process has an uncertain outcome, but one they say is necessary in the face of Israel's offensive in Gaza. The World Bank released a report Tuesday that found the Israel-Hamas war has caused damages of around $18.5 billion to Gaza's critical infrastructure. In Israel, the families of Israeli hostages held in Gaza by Hamas blasted Netanyahu as a traitor due to the prime minister's handling of the war. The mass protests in the country entered their 4th consecutive nights. Meanwhile, ultra-Orthodox parties threatened this past week to leave the Netanyahu coalition government in a move that could possibly cause the government to collapse if the Israeli military starts recruiting yeshiva students. In Washington, the U.S. President Joe Biden downsized the traditional Ramadan event at the White House amid tensions over his support for Israel's offensive in Gaza. And while Turkey's opposition party won big on Sunday in municipal elections, local election authorities in the country's Kurdish-majority southeast region annulled a victory by the pro-Kurdish DEM Party and instead awarded the mandate to the AKP, or the ruling party's candidate. The move sparked outrage from opposition parties and rights groups. From our own newsroom, Al Monitor's president and chief content officer, Andrew Parasility, appeared on CGTN Tuesday morning. Here's a brief clip from the segment.
I think this is yet the latest incident in a number of tragedies that have happened in Gaza. You have over 32,000, many civilians, mostly civilians, women and children have been killed. We can start there. We can start with, also in your report, the attack on the El Shifa hospital and other hospitals, on places of worship, on the famine, on the destruction of residential buildings. So the international outrage that you referred to in the beginning is only going to grow.
And now, on to the main show with Elizabeth Hagedorn. Elizabeth, welcome back to the All Monitor Brief.
Thanks for having me, Kristen.
So you've just written this piece on how the Biden administration is preparing to send diplomats back to Libya. About 10 years ago, after the violent unrest in the country forced the U.S. Embassy to close its doors in the capital of Tripoli. Your latest provides a behind-the-scenes look at these plans. For our listeners just tuning in, can you give us a brief history lesson on how we got here?
Sure. To understand U.S. interests in Libya, Kristen, you need to go back to the Arab Spring movement in 2011. As popular uprisings raged in neighboring countries like Tunisia and Egypt, Libyans also took to the streets to protest the decade-long rule of Muammar Gaddafi. What began as peaceful protests, however, quickly turned violent when Gaddafi's forces began attacking anti-government rebels. The United States and other NATO countries began a campaign of airstrikes to enforce a no-fly zone over Libya, and some 7 months later, Gaddafi was captured and killed by rebel forces. But his death did not bring peace to Libya, far from it. By 2014, the country was engulfed in civil war between 2 rival factions, each of which was backed by foreign powers that flooded the country with weapons and mercenaries. At the outbreak of that war, the United States hastily shuttered its embassy and evacuated its personnel from the country. Fast forwarding to October 2020, the United Nations brokered a ceasefire between those warring parties. That brought relative calm to Libya, but the United Nations has since been unable to get Libya's political elite to agree to hold nationwide elections that would hopefully, once and for all, unify the country. Supporting the United Nations in that effort is one of the reasons the U.S. cites for wanting to return its diplomats to Libya.
Wow. Okay. So over a decade of uncertainty and many years of unrest. Now that we're caught up to the current day, 2024, you reported that the State Department formally notified lawmakers of its plan to restore U.S. diplomatic presence in Libya. Can you give some insight into their plans on restoring a diplomatic presence?
That's right. Well, for about a decade, there has been no U.S. embassy in Libya. The diplomats who are assigned to cover Libya for the United States are instead based in Tunisia, in what's referred to as the Libya External Office. They make periodic and brief trips to Libya, but for the most part are conducting diplomacy remotely. As you can imagine, it makes it that much harder for them to monitor what's happening on the ground in Libya, as well as to build and maintain relationships with Libyan actors. And that's a problem, right? Because while Libya may not rank that high on the administration's list of priorities, instability in Africa's most oil-rich country could undermine counterterrorism efforts, send new migration flows into Europe, and expand Russia's sphere of influence. So last month, the Biden administration formally notified Congress, as I reported, that it is planning to send a more robust permanent presence into Libya's capital of Tripoli. Not an embassy per se, but instead what it's calling an interim diplomatic facility. It'll be used by the Tunisia-based American diplomats, as well as officials working in Washington, to make longer and more frequent trips to Libya. And if all goes to plan, my expectation is we'll eventually one day see a U.S. flag raised over a formal American embassy in Libya.
Fascinating. Okay, so the U.S. is essentially playing catch up. Major partners and adversaries of the United States, if I understand correctly, have already had a presence there. Does this explain why the U.S. is heading back in?
It absolutely does, Kristen. France, Italy, the United Kingdom, Turkey, Egypt, these are just some of the countries that have reopened their embassies in Libya in recent years. Critically, so has Russia. Its desire to expand its military and political reach out of NATO's southern flank is of major concern to the Biden administration. Setting off alarm bells in recent months were multiple visits by Russia's deputy defense minister to Libya, where Moscow's interests include access to the country's vast oil wealth and naval ports. Russia, of course, has long been a dominant player in Libya with the support of Wagner Group mercenaries. It tried to tip the balance of the Libyan civil war in favor of warlord Khalifa Haftar. Now, after the death of Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin last August, the Russian government is said to have brought remnants of Wagner under its direct supervision in Libya and elsewhere. And meanwhile, the Russian embassy is taking full advantage of the U.S. diplomatic void, I'm told. Its ambassador is said to be very active. As one Libyan official put it to me, he's using the "we're here in Libya and the Americans aren't" as a kind of sales pitch.
Okay, so major partners, adversaries in the country. And through your reporting, you've laid out why the U.S. has made the case for a renewed presence in Libya. But it seems like not everyone in Washington is on the same page. Can you explain how this has become a bit of a partisan issue?
Well, it's hard to talk about U.S. involvement in Libya without talking about Benghazi. It was in the Libyan city of Benghazi that heavily armed Islamist militants in 2012 attacked the U.S. consulate and killed Ambassador Chris Stevens and 3 other Americans. That attack not only brought increased scrutiny of U.S. diplomatic outposts around the world, it also spawned one of the costliest and most partisan congressional investigations in history. Now, today, the Republican lawmakers who led the charge to investigate the Obama administration's handling in Benghazi are mostly out of office. People who served on the House Select Committee on Benghazi, names like Trey Gowdy and Mike Pompeo. That said, Benghazi still colors the views of many people on the Hill, especially House Republicans, who I'm told are already pushing back on the State Department's plans for Libya.
Elizabeth, great reporting. I'm sure there'll be more in the coming months, and we'll come back to you for all the updates. Thanks so much for joining.
Thanks, Kristen.